Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a hidden economic crisis that is literally threatening the very foundations of global technology. Behind all the daily headlines of geopolitical tension, two foundational global economies are quietly panicking over a massive disruption. It's really a story of extreme vulnerability, massive energy bottlenecks, and how a distant conflict could soon determine whether you can even buy your next car, phone, or computer.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the forgotten casualties, look closely at some case studies comparing Japan and South Korea, track the global tech cascade, examine this diplomatic trap they're caught in, and finally look at a major generational shift.
All right, starting with Section 1, the forgotten casualties.
So, we're currently looking at a massive geopolitical disruption centered around the Strait of Hormuz. But the real story? It's about who is actually taking the economic hit thousands of miles away, completely trapped by their own strategic alliances. We are talking about Japan and South Korea, the world's third and 10th largest economies, respectively. I mean, these aren't just small peripheral markets, they are absolute industrial powerhouses. And right now, they are more exposed to a disruption in Hormuz than any other country on Earth, well, with the single exception of China. Their entire economic engines are incredibly vulnerable to what happens in that one narrow waterway. Let's move into Section 2, case studies on Japan and South Korea. Let's actually put these two massive economies side by side to really understand their parallel energy vulnerabilities. And we'll start with Japan. A staggering 90% of Japan's oil is imported. 90%. And a massive portion of that imported oil arrives via maritime routes that are bottlenecked directly at the Strait of Hormuz. Japan's entire industrial base absolutely relies on this steady, uninterrupted flow of tankers making their way through the Middle East. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast when we look over at South Korea. South Korea relies on importing virtually 100% of its oil. 100%. But it doesn't stop there. About 33% of its natural gas is imported as liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and a ton of that originates from Qatar and has to transit directly through Hormuz. They are absolutely tethered to this specific trade route. So what exactly happens when that route is threatened? Well, we have to look at their safety nets. For Japan, their strategic petroleum reserve covers about 230 days of net imports at normal consumption rates. Now, 230 days sounds like a pretty healthy buffer, right? Actually, scratch that, because here is the critical context. Under a Hormuz disruption, imports are drastically reduced across the board. Furthermore, Japan is suddenly forced to compete directly against China for any alternative supplies on the global market. In that kind of high-pressure scenario, a 230-day buffer shrinks incredibly rapidly. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the alarming contrast for South Korea. Their strategic petroleum reserve covers roughly 90 days. That's less than half of Japan's reserve. If supply rates are disrupted, that 90-day window evaporates so fast under crisis conditions. It's quite literally a ticking clock for the 10th largest economy in the world. Which brings us to Section 3, the global tech cascade. Now, you might be wondering, why does an energy crunch in Tokyo or Seoul matter to me? Well, let's walk through the steps of this cascade to see how a distant bottleneck ends up right in your living room. Step 1. The Strait of Hormuz is disrupted. Step 2. Because of their intense reliance on that route, Asian energy prices skyrocket overnight. Step 3. As those energy costs become totally unsustainable, manufacturing in Japan and South Korea just stalls. And finally, Step 4. Because these two nations are so foundational to global supply chains, that stall translates into a massive global tech shortage. We're talking about severe delays and huge price spikes for every semiconductor, every car, and every electronic device made on Earth. This isn't just an Asian energy crisis, it's a global technology crisis waiting to happen. Let's look at Section 4, the diplomatic trap. To make matters even more complicated, Tokyo and Seoul find themselves locked in an almost impossible geopolitical position. Both Japan and South Korea are very close U.S. allies bound by strict security treaties. They depend entirely on the U.S. military umbrella for protection against very real regional threats, like North Korea and China. Because of this absolute reliance on U.S. protection, they cannot publicly criticize a U.S. conflict, even if they had no say in starting it. Doing so would endanger their core security alliances. But simultaneously, their economies are being devastated by the fallout of that very conflict. They're essentially forced to suffer in silence. So the crucial point is this brutal imbalance. On one side of the equation, Japanese and Korean manufacturers are bleeding cash, paying astronomical crisis premiums for oil and LNG just to keep their lights on. On the other side, they are trying to compete globally against American companies that have access to abundant, cheap domestic energy. It's a massively uneven playing field, created by a conflict they didn't ask for and one they are diplomatically forbidden from complaining about. Moving to Section 5, a generational shift. Let's see how this builds into the desperate, long-term strategies both nations are actively adopting just to survive this. Comparing their parallel strategic pivots, Japan has been quietly pushing to increase LNG imports from Australia to diversify away from Hormuz, and they are actively restarting nuclear reactors that were shut down after Fukushima. Meanwhile, South Korea is managing the immediate pain through aggressive reserve drawdowns, all while heavily expanding its own nuclear fleet. So both are pivoting hard towards nuclear and supply diversification to reduce that Middle Eastern dependency. But, here is the reality check. Long-term solutions absolutely cannot fix a short-term crisis. Building alternative supply routes and bringing nuclear reactors online takes years, sometimes even decades. The Hormuz disruption is happening right now, causing devastating economic damage today. This actually brings us to a quote directly from our source material that perfectly captures the situation. It reads, "Japan and South Korea are the forgotten casualties of the Iran war, allies being economically hammered by an allied war." It's just a stark summary of how these foundational economies are silently taking the brunt of the economic hit from a geopolitical conflict they didn't choose to engage in.
And that leaves us with a really critical, provocative question to ponder. As Tokyo and Seoul watch the U.S. prioritize conflicts in the Gulf, which is causing them massive economic strain, while their own Indo-Pacific security threats remain, what happens next? The strain on these alliances is very real. It might not break them today for sure. But we have to ask, how will this reshape Indo-Pacific alliances and how these nations view their dependence on the United States for the next generation? It's a fascinating and complex situation, and I hope this explainer helped you understand the mechanics at play. Thanks so much for joining me.